13. Know your enemy. The intelligence strategy. The target of your strategy should be less the army you face than the mind of the man or woman who runs it. If you understand how that mind works, you have the key to deceiving and controlling it. Train yourself to read people, picking up the signals they unconsciously send about their innermost thoughts and intentions. A friendly front will let you watch them closely and mine them for information. Beware of projecting your own emotions and mental habits onto them. Try to think as they think. By finding your opponent's psychological weaknesses, you can work to unhinge their minds. The mirrored enemy. In June 1838, Lord Auckland, the British Governor-General of India, called a meeting of his top officials to discuss a proposed invasion of Afghanistan. Auckland and other British ministers had become increasingly concerned at Russia's growing influence in the area. The Russians had already made an ally of Persia. They were now trying to do the same with Afghanistan, and if they were successful, the British in India would find themselves potentially cut off by land to the west and vulnerable to more incursions by the Russians. Instead of trying to outdo the Russians and negotiate an alliance with the Afghan ruler, Dost Muhammad, Auckland proposed what he thought was a surer solution: invade Afghanistan and install a new ruler, Shah Shuja, a former Afghan leader forced out of power 25 years earlier, who would then be indebted to the English. Among the men listening to Auckland that day was William Macnaghten, the 45-year-old chief secretary of the Calcutta government. Macnaghten thought the invasion a brilliant idea. A friendly Afghanistan would secure British interests in the area and even help to spread British influence. And the invasion could hardly fail. The British Army would have no trouble sweeping away the primitive Afghan tribesmen. They would present themselves as liberators, freeing the Afghans from Russian tyranny and bringing to the country the support and civilizing influence of England. As soon as Shah Shuja was in power, the army would leave, so that British influence over the grateful Shah, although powerful, would be invisible to the Afghan public. When it came time for Macnaghten to give his opinion on the proposed invasion, his support of it was so sound and enthusiastic that Lord Auckland not only decided to go ahead, he named Macnaghten the Queen's envoy to Kabul, the Afghan capital, the top British representative in Afghanistan. Meeting little resistance along the way, in August 1839 the British Army reached Kabul. Dost Muhammad fled to the mountains, and the Shah re-entered the city. To the local inhabitants, this was a strange sight. Shah Shuja, whom many could barely remember, looked old and submissive alongside Macnaghten, who rode into Kabul wearing a bright-colored uniform topped by a cocked hat fringed with ostrich feathers. Why had these people come? What were they doing here? With the Shah back in power, Macnaghten had to reassess the situation. Reports came in informing him that Dost Muhammad was building an army in the mountains to the north. Meanwhile, to the south, it seemed that in invading the country, the British had insulted some local chieftains by plundering their lands for food. These chiefs were now stirring up trouble. It was also clear that the Shah was unpopular with his former subjects, so unpopular that Macnaghten could not leave him and other British interests in the country unprotected. Reluctantly, Macnaghten ordered most of the British Army to remain in Afghanistan until the situation was stabilized. Time went by, and eventually Macnaghten decided to allow the officers and soldiers of this increasingly long-standing occupying force to send for their families, so that life would be less harsh for them. Soon the wives and children came, along with their Indian servants. But where Macnaghten had imagined that the arrival of the soldiers' families would have a humanizing, civilizing effect, it only alarmed the Afghans. Were the British planning a permanent occupation? Everywhere the local people looked, there were representatives of British interests, talking loudly in the streets, drinking wine, attending theaters and horse races, strange imported pleasures that they had introduced to the country. Now their families were making themselves at home. A hatred of everything English began to take root. There were those who warned Macnaghten about this, and to all of them he had the same answer. Everything would be forgotten and forgiven when the army left Afghanistan. The Afghans were childlike, emotional people. Once they felt the benefits of English civilization, they would be more than grateful. One matter, however, did worry the envoy. The British government was unhappy about the increasing expense of the occupation. Macnaghten would have to do something to cut costs, and he knew just where to begin. Most of the mountain passes through which Afghanistan's main trade routes ran were held by the Rilziye tribes, who for many years, over the lives of many different rulers of the country, had been paid a stipend to keep the passes open. Macnaghten decided to cut this stipend in half. The Rilziye responded by blocking the passes, and elsewhere in the country, tribes sympathetic to the Rilziye rebelled. Macnaghten, caught off guard, tried to put these rebellions down, but he did not take them too seriously, and worried officers who told him to respond more vigorously were rebuked for overreacting. Now the British Army would have to stay indefinitely. The situation deteriorated quickly. In October 1841, a mob attacked the home of a British official and killed him. In Kabul, local chiefs began to conspire to expel their British overlords. Shah Shuja panicked. For months he had begged Macnaghten to let him capture and kill his main rivals, an Afghan ruler's traditional method of securing his position. Macnaghten had told him that a civilized country did not use murder to solve its political problems. The Shah knew that the Afghans respected strength and authority, not civilized values. To them, his failure to deal with his enemies made him look weak and unruler-like, and left them surrounded by enemies. Macnaghten would not listen. The rebellion spread, and Macnaghten now had to confront the fact that he did not have the manpower to put down a general uprising. But why should he panic? The Afghans and their leaders were naive. He would regain the upper hand through intrigue and cleverness. To that end, Macnaghten publicly negotiated an agreement whereby British troops and citizens would leave Afghanistan, in exchange for which the Afghans would supply the retreating British with food. Privately, though, Macnaghten made it known to a few key chiefs that he was willing to make one of them the country's vizier and load him with money, in exchange for putting down the rebellion and allowing the English to stay. The chief of the eastern Rilziye, Akbar Khan, responded to this offer, and on December 23, 1841, Macnaghten rode out for a private meeting with him to seal the bargain. After exchanging greetings, Akbar asked Macnaghten if he wanted to go ahead with the treachery they were planning. Thrilled to have turned the situation around, Macnaghten cheerily answered that he did. Without a word of explanation, Akbar signaled his men to grab Macnaghten and throw him in prison. He had no intention of betraying the other chiefs. Along the way, a mob developed, caught hold of the unfortunate envoy, and with a fury built up over years of humiliation, literally tore him to pieces. His limbs and head were paraded through the streets of Kabul, and his torso was hung from a meat hook in the bazaar. In a matter of days, everything unraveled. The remaining British troops, some 4,500 of them, along with 12,000 camp followers, were forced to agree to an immediate retreat from Afghanistan, despite the bitter winter weather. The Afghans were to keep the retreating army supplied, but did not do so. Certain that the British would never leave unless forced to, they harassed them relentlessly in their retreat. Civilians and soldiers alike quickly perished in the snow. On January 13th, British forces at the fort in Jalalabad saw a single horse struggling toward the gates. Its half-dead writer, Dr. William Bryden, was the sole survivor of the British Army's doomed invasion of Afghanistan. Interpretation. The knowledge that would have averted the catastrophe was at MacNaughton's fingertips long before he launched the expedition. Englishmen and Indians who had lived in Afghanistan could have told him that the Afghan people were among the proudest and most independent on the planet. To them, the image of foreign troops marching into Kabul would constitute an unforgivable humiliation. On top of that, they were not a people yearning for peace, prosperity, and reconciliation. In fact, they saw strife and confrontation as a healthy way of life. MacNaughton had the information, but refused to see it. Instead, he projected onto the Afghans the values of an Englishman, which he mistakenly assumed were universal. Blinded by narcissism, he misread every signal along the way. As a result, his strategic moves, leaving the British Army occupying Kabul, cutting in half the Grilzier stipend, trying not to overplay his hand in putting down the rebellions, were exactly the opposite of what was needed. And on that fateful day, when he literally lost his head, he made the ultimate miscalculation, imagining that money and an appeal to self-interest would buy loyalty among the very people he had so humiliated. Blindness and narcissism like this are not so rare. We find them every day. Our natural tendency is to see other people as mere reflections of our own desires and values. Failing to understand the ways they are not like us, we are surprised when they do not respond as we had imagined. We unintentionally offend and alienate people, then blame them, not our inability to understand them, for the damage done. Understand. If you let narcissism act as a screen between you and other people, you will misread them, and your strategies will misfire. You must be aware of this and struggle to see others dispassionately. Every individual is like an alien culture. You must get inside his or her way of thinking, not as an exercise in sensitivity, but out of strategic necessity. Only by knowing your enemies can you ever hope to vanquish them. Keys to warfare. The greatest power you could have in life would come neither from limitless resources nor even consummate skill in strategy. It would come from clear knowledge of those around you, the ability to read people like a book. Given that knowledge, you could distinguish friend from foe, smoking out snakes in the grass. You could anticipate your enemy's malice, pierce their strategies, and take defensive action. Their transparency would reveal to you the emotions they could least control. Armed with that knowledge, you could make them tumble into traps and destroy them. The leaders who have made best use of intelligence, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Prince Metternich, Winston Churchill, Lyndon Johnson during his career in the U.S. Senate, were all, first and foremost, great students of human nature and superior readers of men. They honed their skills through personal observation of people. Only with that foundation could the use of spies extend their powers of vision. Understand. Day in and day out, people emit signals that reveal their intentions and deepest desires. If we do not pick them up, it is because we are not paying attention. The reason for this is simple. We are usually locked up in our own worlds, listening to our internal monologues, obsessed with ourselves and with satisfying our own egos. We tend to see other people merely as reflections of ourselves. To the extent that you can drop your self-interest and see people for who they are, divorced from your desires, you will become more sensitive to their signals. You will be amazed at how much you can pick up about people if you can shut off your incessant interior monologue, empty your thoughts, and anchor yourself in the moment. The details you now see give you unfiltered information from which you can put together an accurate picture of people's weaknesses and desires. Be particularly attentive to their eyes. It takes a lot of effort to hide the eye's message about a person's state of mind. It is, of course, critical that people be unaware you are watching them so closely. Do not ask too many questions. The trick is to get people to relax and open up without prodding, shadowing them so quietly that they never guess what you're really up to. In general, it is easier to observe people in action, particularly in moments of crisis. Those are the times when they either reveal their weaknesses or struggle so hard to disguise it that you can see through the mask. You can actively probe them by doing things that seem harmless but get a response. Maybe say something bold or provocative, then see how they react. Making people emotional, pushing their buttons, will touch some deep part of their nature. Either they will let slip some truth about themselves, or they will put on a mask that you, in a laboratory situation you have created, will be able to peer behind. The quality of the information you gather on your enemies is more important than the quantity. A single but crucial nugget can be the key to their destruction. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal saw that the Roman general he was facing was arrogant and hot-tempered, he would deliberately play weak, luring the man into a rash attack. Once Churchill saw that Hitler had a paranoid streak, becoming irrational at the merest hint of vulnerability. The British Prime Minister knew how to unhinge the German Führer. By feigning to attack some marginal area like the Balkans, he could make him see threats on all sides and spread out his defenses, a critical military mistake. Always look for internal spies, people in the enemy camp who are dissatisfied and have an axe to grind. Turn them to your purposes, and they will give you better information than any infiltrator you sneak in from outside. Hire people the enemy has fired. They will tell you how the enemy thinks. President Bill Clinton got his best intelligence on the Republicans from his advisor Dick Morris, who had worked for them for years and knew their weaknesses, both personal and organizational. A warning: never rely on one spy, one source of information, no matter how good. You risk being played or getting slanted, one-sided information. Finally, the enemy you are dealing with is not an inanimate object that will simply respond in an expected manner to your strategies. Your enemies are constantly changing and adapting to what you are doing. Innovating and inventing on their own, they try to learn from their mistakes and from your successes. So your knowledge of the enemy cannot be static. Keep your intelligence up to date and do not rely on the enemy's responding the same way twice. Defeat is a stern teacher, and your beaten opponent today may be wiser tomorrow. Your strategies must take this possibility into account. Your knowledge of the enemy must be not just deep, but timely. Reversal. Even as you work to know your enemies, be aware that they are scrutinizing you, and either give them nothing or feed them misinformation. Keeping yourself formless and inscrutable will make it impossible for people to defend themselves against you and render the intelligence they gather on you useless.